Police humiliates black man without knowing he is a millionaire. What happens then is shocking. It was an ordinary day in busy New York City. James Carter, a renowned investor and millionaire, known for his discretion and charity, decided it was time to dress simply, without the attire that characterized him in the financial world, and enjoy a day like any other citizen. Wearing jeans, a t-shirt and a cap, he walked through the city streets with the purpose of reconnecting with the reality of ordinary people, those to whom he used to donate part of his fortune. If you've made it this far, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss stories like this, and comment which city you are watching from to support our work. Stay until the end, because the outcome of this story is something you won't want to miss. Everything seemed normal until a local police officer, Officer Bradley, noticed him as he passed through an area where security was a constant reason for patrolling. Observing him suspiciously and judging him solely on his appearance, Bradley approached, beginning an approach marked by arrogance and prejudice. Without verifying James's identity, the police officer began aggressively questioning him, accusing him of wandering around with bad intentions, and little by little starting to insult him. As the police officer raised his tone, James remained calm, but with his eyes fixed, enduring public humiliation, a new experience for him, who had always been treated with respect in circles of high financial prestige. The crowd began to observe. Some whispered, but few dared to intervene. The moment was uncomfortable and humiliating, especially for James, who as a black man was aware that his status would never fully protect him from racial stereotypes. At this point, Officer Bradley seemed completely convinced that he was facing a suspicious citizen and felt justified in being rude. He used derogatory terms and a threatening tone without giving James the slightest chance to respond or defend himself. The scene was a life lesson, both for James and those watching around him. However, behind his subdued expression, there was a faint hint of indignation. James knew that his influence could change the situation, but he chose to observe how far the police officer's arrogance would go, and also better understand the reality faced by so many people who did not have the same privileges as him. He knew that many people face these situations daily, and he, at that moment, began to see this experience as an opportunity for something greater. Finally, in a moment of loss of control, the police officer tried to forcibly search James, ordering him to put his hands against the wall. That scene reached the height of humiliation, and a gasp of surprise passed through the watching crowd. James, even though he was a man of power and prestige, was treated there as a criminal without rights, solely because of blind prejudice. Fate was preparing an unexpected outcome for this story, and James at that moment was already starting to plan how he would act, knowing that something big was coming. James Carter, more than a successful man, was a person deeply connected to the roots of his community. Despite becoming a millionaire, he never completely strayed from the places that shaped him. He understood the value of his fortune not only for himself, but for others around him, and, therefore, dedicated a large part of his resources to social causes, focusing on the education of young black people and inclusion projects. He was an idealist in the most practical sense, someone who believed that every act of charity could inspire others to change the world. The decision to walk the streets of New York, simply and without his usual team of security guards, was part of an experiment he occasionally carried out to better understand the challenges many faced. His friends and family always warned him about the dangers of such adventures, but James was completely confident that he would know how to handle himself. His main objective had always been to blend in, to feel the reality of the streets and less favored neighborhoods. Officer Bradley, on the other hand, had a completely opposite trajectory. Son of a traditional New York family, he believed in strict adherence to the rules, but with a distorted view of his mission. Throughout his career, Bradley had been involved in several controversies because of his aggressive and prejudiced approaches, although he always escaped the accusations unharmed. His authoritarian stance was a trademark, and he frequently abused his power to intimidate those he deemed suspicious, usually minority individuals. To Bradley, James was just another man out of place, someone he judged without even saying a word. The rude, insult-laden approach was Bradley's way of demonstrating his control, and he believed no one would dare challenge him. The police officer was so convinced of his superiority that he never considered the possibility that he was making a very serious mistake. Meanwhile, a crowd began to gather, watching the interaction with expressions of surprise and discomfort. People around knew something was wrong, but the power of Bradley's uniform intimidated anyone who thought of intervening. There was, however, a man among the spectators, a photographer named Kevin Ortiz, who decided to document the scene. He knew that the image of a black man being humiliated by a police officer could open up space for important questions and debates. Kevin had already seen similar situations and believed that exposing these injustices was a fundamental step towards social change. As Bradley continued his approach, his voice became increasingly aggressive, and he began to insult James with words that blatantly expressed prejudice. He completely ignored the looks of the people around him, sure that no one would report him. And James, who still maintained his firm and silent stance, felt a growing anger, but at the same time, a sense of responsibility. He knew that moment was bigger than him. Inside him, a mix of indignation and empathy made him reflect on all those who, without his power and influence, went through similar situations and were completely helpless. He understood that at that moment he had an important choice to make: retaliate immediately or create an opportunity for greater impact. And so, amid harsh words and contemptuous looks from the police officer, James decided to remain silent. But only for now. The tense atmosphere surrounding the scene seemed to intensify with every second. The voices of the police officer and the public mingled in a murmur of indignation and curiosity. Bradley, completely absorbed in his own distorted vision of justice, ignored the looks of disapproval and disappointment that came from all sides. He was so fixated on his intimidating approach that he didn't realize the impact his words were having. James, in turn, felt increasingly pressured. The moment had become not just a question of personal dignity, but a question of representation and resistance against systematic injustices. In this context, the figure of Kevin Ortiz stood out in the crowd. He continued to photograph the scene, capturing every expression, every movement. I knew that each click was an opportunity to tell a story that could touch hearts and awaken consciences. His camera became a powerful weapon, a means of documenting not only that moment, but also the multiple layers of oppression that many faced on a daily basis. As he watched, he realized that James's story could become a symbol of resistance and at the same time a call to action. The situation escalated when Bradley, in a moment of blind rage, decided that James's humiliation needed to be more severe. He moved even closer, forcing the man back. "Do you really think you can walk around here like someone?" said the policeman with a sarcastic smile. "To me, you're just a criminal on the prowl, disguised in cheap clothes." Bradley's words were cutting, and James felt a wave of indignation course through him. With each insult, the pressure grew, and he knew he needed to act, but in a way that would have a lasting impact. In the crowd, a middle-aged woman named Marta stepped forward, unable to bear the spectacle of oppression any longer. She was a retired teacher who had dedicated her life to educating young people about equality and civil rights. With a determined look, she decided it was time to intervene. "Hey, police officer," she shouted in a voice that echoed among those present. "You are dishonoring your uniform. "This man is not a criminal. He is a human being. You have no right to treat him like this." His courage inspired a few others in the crowd to come forward, and soon there was a small group of supporters around James, ready to defend his dignity. The mood changed, and Bradley, realizing that his authority was being challenged, became even more aggressive. He turned to Marta, increasing the volume of his voice. "You don't know what you're talking about. I know what's best for this community." But Marta, unfazed, retorted, "And what do you really know? What have you done besides intimidating innocent people? You're not helping anyone." James, now surrounded by people supporting him, felt a surge of solidarity. This collective energy was beginning to change the dynamic. He began to understand that his presence there was not just a test of himself, but a catalyst for greater change. He finally prepared himself to reveal his true identity. James's decision was not impulsive. He knew he needed to be strategic. In doing so, he wanted to not only debunk prejudice, but also educate those who were watching. With a firm but controlled tone, James finally spoke. "Sir Police Officer, you judge me without knowing the truth. I'm a businessman and I've helped many people get up in their difficulties. I'm here because I want to understand what's going on in the streets, not because I'm a criminal. You need to learn to look beyond your uniform and see people as they really are." His words were an appeal to the humanity of everyone present, and the crowd began to murmur, frightened and intrigued by what they were hearing. Bradley, taken by surprise, hesitated. The situation, which was once under his control, now seemed to be slipping through his fingers. He was sure that James was just a simple man, but now everything he believed in was being challenged. The possibility of a black man, whom he had looked down on, being a successful leader, began to erode his self-confidence. The tension was reaching its peak, and everyone was paying attention to what would happen next. The crowd, now united, formed a protective shield around James. Bradley, realizing that the situation was no longer in his favor, decided to retreat, but the look of disdain and contempt still remained on his face as he mouthed a threat about consequences for challenging his authority. The tension was palpable, and the atmosphere of the scene changed drastically after James's revelation. The crowd, once a simple audience, transformed into a united community, willing to defend one of their own. However, the impact of the humiliation that James had suffered extended beyond the moment, revealing subplots that connected not only the protagonists, but also the others present. Marta, the retired teacher, began to realize that her interposition had set off a series of chain reactions. For her, the act of courage was more than simply defending James. It was a reaffirmation of his own mission in life. In recent years, she had seen a decrease in young people's engagement in discussions about civil rights. That scene was an opportunity to inspire and educate again, and she was determined not to let the chance pass her by. The idea of forming a civil rights group in his community began to blossom in his mind. Meanwhile, on the front lines, James felt that his personal struggle could have a much greater scope than he imagined. The support of strangers encouraged him to share his experience. He knew his situation was not unique. Many others faced the same type of discrimination. In a conversation with one of the supporters, Louise, a young lawyer, James heard about the possibility of starting a movement to defend victims of racial discrimination and police abuse. Together, they began to draft ideas on how to join forces and assert their rights. James realized he could be a spokesperson, someone who would use his voice and influence to make a difference. As the interactions between James, Marta, and Louise deepened, Kevin Ortiz, the photographer, didn't just document the events. He decided he also had a role to play. He was aware of the power of images and the importance of capturing the essence of the fight. Kevin began planning a series of photographs and interviews that would tell the story of James and everyone who has been touched by injustice. For him, each click was not just a moment frozen in time, it was an opportunity to provoke reflection and change. Their goal was to create an exhibition that highlighted not only James's struggle, but also those of others in the same situation, connecting the stories of different voices calling for equality. The narrative began to intertwine with the lives of other characters in the crowd. A young woman named Carla, who had witnessed the scene, recalled her own experience of discrimination in a job interview. What had discouraged her at the time now became fuel for action. She joined Marta, Luis, and James, deciding it was time to start an awareness campaign in local schools about prejudice and discrimination. The movement was gaining strength, and James was becoming a central figure in a project that was about to be born. However, not everyone was supportive. Bradley, the police officer, was facing his own consequences. His arrogant and disdainful attitude had not gone unnoticed by his superiors. Complaints began to emerge, and an inquiry into his conduct was opened. While trying to downplay the situation, the pressure was building. What was once a simple police approach had now become a case study in abuse of authority. He began to feel isolated, pressured, and in some ways guilty about the way he had treated James. Daily interactions that were once safe and carefree were now filled with distrust and fear. The scenario was changing, and what began as a simple humiliation was expanding into a community movement. James, now surrounded by friends and supporters, felt he was on a new journey. It was an opportunity to turn pain into power, to use her experience to inspire change. The idea of creating a support network for those facing discrimination was taking shape, and each of the secondary characters had a key role in this new storyline. Time passed, and the situation on social media also began to change. James's story and Marta's intervention quickly went viral. People began sharing their own experiences, and support for the cause began to grow. This online movement attracted the attention of activists and influencers who were ready to help amplify the message. James and his friends became the voice of a new generation that refused to be silenced. The atmosphere was tense in the following weeks, following James's public humiliation. The backlash on social media had created a wave of support that seemed unwavering, but it also raised the ire of people who defended the traditional way of dealing with police and law enforcement. The community was divided. Some saw James as a hero, while others considered him a provocateur. It was in this tumultuous scenario that an unexpected event would change the course of everything. At a meeting organized by Marta and Luis, where the group met to discuss the movement's next steps, a shocking event occurred. During the meeting, which was being broadcast live to a growing audience online, a video began circulating on social media. It was security footage of James's initial stop, which showed not only the officer's brutality, but also inappropriate behavior involving racism and aggression. The recording captured offensive words the officer used, along with moments when James was verbally attacked. The video spread like wildfire, with comments piling up in support of James, but at the same time, pressure on authorities increased. The video going viral not only exposed the failure of the police officer's behavior, but also brought to light a series of other similar cases where the police force acted disproportionately. Bradley, now a cornered man, was terrified of the repercussions. The video, which had been a simple document of his initial approach, now became evidence against him. What was a simple attempt to maintain order quickly turned into a scandal that called into question the integrity of his profession. The police officer found himself in the eye of a storm, with everyone's eyes focused on him and his conduct. Pressure from his superiors increased, and a formal inquiry was opened. Meanwhile, James was beginning to realize that his personal struggle had turned into something much bigger. The support he received grew day by day, and now he was not just a humiliated man, but a symbol of resistance. During a press conference he called, James looked directly into the camera and declared, "I'm not just a victim, I'm a survivor. And the fight we started is not just for me, but for everyone who has been silenced and treated unfairly." The impact of his words echoed. The video was widely discussed, but James's message of transformation and resistance gained traction. The movement that he and Marta, Luis and Carla were creating began to attract media attention. It was in the headlines of newspapers and on TV stations. James had become a public figure, an activist for a cause that went beyond what he initially expected. On the other hand, the pressure on Bradley intensified. He began to feel surrounded, unsupported, and the consequences of his actions began to unfold. In a moment of despair, he decided to seek solace on his social media, but instead, he was faced with an avalanche of negative comments. The public perception against him was turning into an outright attack, and when it seemed like the situation couldn't get any worse, a new twist happened. During a press conference, amid questions about his behavior, a figure from Bradley's past appeared. Alex, a former co-worker who had left the police. Alex had his own demons, a past stained by decisions that led him to distance himself from a force he considered corrupt. He made an impactful statement, revealing that it wasn't the first time Bradley had been involved in troubling incidents. Alex shared experiences of how Bradley frequently flouted norms of conduct, using his power inappropriately and perpetuating a culture of fear and intimidation. This revelation left the police officer vulnerable and at the same time became a watershed for James's movement. The video, the press conference, and now Alex's revelations have created a domino effect. James and his allies realized they were at a turning point. It was time to turn the groundswell of support into a lasting force that could really make a difference. They began meeting again, discussing ways to institutionalize their demands and seek changes in local security and justice policies. Bradley, on the other hand, was struggling to stay afloat. The pressure was intense, and he began to realize that his life was falling apart. What began as a simple humiliation of James had turned into a significant fight that could change the future of police-community relations. And he, who previously felt in control, was now at the mercy of the consequences of his actions. At this point, the fight had become not just about James and his experience, but about an entire system that needed to be examined and reformed. Character motivations became clearer and more complex, and the consequences of individual decisions were now connected to a larger narrative that demanded attention and action. The impact of the press conference, along with Alex's revelations, resonated deeply throughout the community. The atmosphere was boiling. James and his movement had become a symbol of resistance and the fight against injustice. Social media was full of hashtags like Justiça para James and Mudança Já, which quickly became a rallying cry for those who wanted a fairer and more transparent system. The developments were quick and profound. The police department, under intense pressure from the media and community, decided to suspend Bradley. The scandal surrounding his conduct could not be ignored. The senior management's decision, although late, was a sign that the community's voices were being heard. However, this did not ease the pressure on James, who now faced a new set of challenges. While James became a spokesperson for the movement, his personal life began to suffer. He received anonymous threats, which were a clear attempt to silence him and intimidation to keep him away from activism. The threats only increased his resolve, but his family was worried. Marta and Luis were by his side, but the tension was building. James knew he was tapping into something bigger, something that couldn't be ignored, but at the same time, he felt the weight on his shoulders. Marta, realizing the impact that all of this was having on James, decided to organize a support event. a large gathering that would bring the community together to discuss the way forward. The idea was not only to celebrate the achievements so far, but also to solidify the message and demands of the movement. They invited representatives from various civil rights organizations, influencers, and surprisingly, public figures who were willing to speak out in favor of change. The event was an unexpected success. The public turned out in droves, and the enthusiasm was palpable. James took the stage to speak, and as he looked at the crowd supporting him, he felt the strength of solidarity. Today we are not just speaking for myself or an isolated incident. We are here to speak for all those who have suffered in silence, he said, his voice firm. The claps echoed, and the emotion was evident in his speech. The event generated a wave of support on social media, with videos and photos of the meeting spreading quickly. Meanwhile, the consequences for Bradley were devastating. With his reputation ruined and the scandal intensifying, he faced an internal inquiry that could lead to his dismissal. The weight of the accusations and evidence that emerged left no room for defense. The support he had hoped to find among his peers fell apart, and he found himself isolated, dealing with the consequences of his own actions. One day, while walking through a central area of the city, Bradley was approached by a group of young men who recognized him. The contempt in their eyes was undeniable, and they surrounded him, making sarcastic comments and questioning his integrity as a police officer. He felt humiliated, a shadow of the man he once believed himself to be a defender of the law. This interaction made him realize that it wasn't just his career that was at stake, but also how he would be remembered by the community. Bradley decided he needed to do something to try to redeem himself, not just for himself, but for those who felt unfairly treated. He began meeting with Alex, hoping to understand the situation from a new perspective. Alex became an unexpected mentor, guiding him through a journey of reflection and change. Meanwhile, James and his team were preparing to take their claims to the next level. They decided to create a petition for reforms in local policing practices, highlighting the importance of accountability and transparency. Community support grew every day, and the movement gained momentum, attracting the attention of politicians and civil rights advocates. The contrast between the lives of James and Bradley became increasingly evident. While James received recognition and support, Bradley wallowed in a sea of regret and frustration. He began to realize that change would not just come from the outside, but from a genuine internal effort to recognize and correct his flaws. This internal struggle would become a crucial element in his journey of redemption. James, in turn, felt stronger every day. He understood that the fight would not be easy, but he was determined to continue. The support he received was a constant reminder that change was possible and that his fight could inspire others to stand up against injustice. The journey was just beginning, and he was ready to face it head-on. The pressure on James increased, but instead of being a weight, it became fuel. He realized that, for his fight to be truly effective, he needed to prepare for the challenges that would come. The constant threats and media attention made him reflect on how he could protect himself, both physically and emotionally. He began training with Louise, his friend and former soldier, who guided him in self-defense and stress management techniques. This preparation not only made him safer, but also more confident in his ability to face adversity. James, now seen as a leadership figure, decided he couldn't just react to challenges. He wanted to be proactive in his fight. With this in mind, he began organizing regular meetings with community members, where everyone could share their experiences and discuss strategies. These meetings not only helped strengthen the movement, but also became a safe space for those who felt oppressed. Each story shared was a lesson in resilience and strength, and James learned as much as he taught. Meanwhile, Bradley struggled with his own demons. After pressure and ostracism, He decided he needed help understanding his own story and the failures that led him to that point. He sought therapy and began opening up about his experiences. This process was painful but necessary. Through the sessions, he began to question his beliefs and prejudices, seeking to understand how his actions impacted the lives of James and many others. The desire for change began to emerge. Although the path was long and complicated, James's dates became more popular. He began bringing in experts, such as human rights activists and lawyers, to discuss injustices that often went unnoticed. One of the speakers, a woman named Mariana, brought her personal story of discrimination and how she managed to overcome it through education and activism. Mariana's words resonated deeply with the audience, and many felt inspired to get involved. During one of these meetings, James decided it was time to take a bolder step. He proposed holding a peaceful march to draw attention to injustices in the policing system. The announcement of the march created a frenzy on social media, with people from different backgrounds joining the movement. He realized that the fight for justice wasn't just about him or his experiences. It was a collective effort that needed everyone's voice. However, the difficulties did not ease. The day of the march arrived, and tension was in the air. James and the organizers knew the event could attract both support and opposition. However, his determination was unshakable. "We need to show that we are not afraid," he told his followers before the march. "Let's show that we are a united community and that we will no longer accept injustice." As they marched through the streets, the feeling of solidarity was palpable. People held signs and shouted slogans in support of change. Hearing the cries of "Justice now," James felt a surge of hope. He saw faces of young and old, of all types and colors, uniting for the same cause. This diversity was proof that the struggle transcends individuals. In the middle of the march, something unexpected happened. A group opposing the demonstration approached, carrying hateful signs and shouting insults. James felt butterflies in his stomach as he saw the situation intensify. What was supposed to be a peaceful event was on the verge of a confrontation. But instead of retreating, he remembered everything he had learned about leadership and resilience. At a decisive moment, he stood on a wooden box and shouted to the crowd, "Guys, remember why we are here. We are the voice of change, and we will not allow violence to define us." James' words cut through the tension in the air. Many began to focus on what had been built rather than the hate that was trying to infiltrate. The crowd began singing unit songs, and positive energy quickly spread. Bradley, who had been one of the first to sign up for the march, observed on the opposite side and felt a mixture of pride and remorse. He realized that his old mindset was part of the problem and that change could not be just an empty word. It needed to be a daily practice. After the march, which was a resounding success, James felt he was on the right track. The movement had grown not only in number, but in strength and cohesion. He knew the fight was far from over, but now he had more allies, more strength and a renewed purpose. The consequences of each other's actions began to manifest, and the transformation was happening not only in the community, but also within each person involved. Meanwhile, Bradley's journey was just beginning. He decided he wanted to get involved in the James movement and be part of the change he so defended so much. Recognition of his own responsibility was just the first step, and now he wanted to return. He began working on community policing initiatives, seeking to learn and connect with those who had previously treated as enemies. James and Bradley, who were once strangers, were now interconnected by a journey of overcoming and growth. James's struggle had become a mirror for Bradley's transformation, showing that even in the midst of adversity, there was room for redemption and building a better future. With the successful march and a new sense of unity among community members, James realized it was time to intensify the fight. Media attention had turned to its cause, and the growing wave could be the key to promoting real and significant changes. He knew he needed to enjoy this moment before his attention was diverted. The pressure was high, but James was determined to turn this impulse into action. With the help of Mariana and other members of the movement, James organized a series of strategic meetings. They began planning a new campaign focused on political lobby and the search for reforms that would ensure greater transparency in policing practices. The goal was to get an audience with local leaders and discuss the concerns that emerged during the march. James understood that to achieve lasting changes, it was crucial to bring decision-makers to the table. Meanwhile, Bradley was also preparing. He had become an active defender of the cause and was learning about the problems he once ignored. He began to understand the complexities of policing and how he affected people's lives so that he had never imagined. With the support of James and the community, he was motivated to use his previous experience as a police officer to bring a new perspective on the discussions. He knew it could be a bridge between the community and the authorities, but also needed to face the ghosts of his past. The meetings were full of energy and determination. James spoke with passion, emphasizing the importance of being heard. Mariana shared data and statistics on racial discrimination in police approaches, while other members brought personal reports of traumatic experiences with the police. Each story, each data, reinforced the urgency of the situation and made the movement stronger. The culmination of the planning was the proposal of a large meeting with the police chief. James was nervous but also excited. They were about to take a step that could change the course of local history. The expectations were high, and the pressure was palpable. Everyone knew that this meeting could be a watershed. On the eve of the meeting, James met with Mariana and other community leaders. "We need to be ready for any answer," he said. "We can find resistance, but we need to keep the focus on what we want to achieve." The meeting would be an opportunity not only to expose their concerns, but also to present solutions. James and the others spent the night reviewing their arguments and organizing their ideas. Bradley, who was present, felt divided. He wanted to support James and the community, but was also aware that the status quo forces would not be easy to challenge. However, he decided that he needed to be transparent about his past and that honesty could create a space for dialogue. He prepared himself mentally to share his own journey during the meeting, hoping that this could help to make waves. Finally, the day of the meeting has arrived. James, Mariana, and Bradley went to the police department, accompanied by some community members who were willing to be part of the process. The atmosphere was tense, but also loaded with hope. Upon entering the room, they were received by the police chief and some other officers. What could be a cordial encounter quickly turned into a resistance test. The conversation began friendly, but soon tensions increased when James presented statistics and reports of discrimination. The police chief seemed defensive, and his answers were not comforting. Mariana tried to appeal to logic and evidence, but the boss seemed more interested in maintaining the image of the police force than in listening to the genuine concerns of the community. Frustration grew, and the feeling that they were coming across an insurmountable wall began to spread. Bradley, realizing the growing tension, decided it was time to intervene. With courage, he shared his own story. As a former police officer who had not realized the severity of his actions until he was confronted by James and the community. He talked about the importance of empathy and understanding and how changes needed to occur within the police itself to have a better future. His words, honest and vulnerable, resonated in the room. The police chief, hearing Bradley's perspective, seemed to hesitate. The tension was there, but something had changed. James, seeing an opportunity, continued to press, asking for concrete solutions and an opening to the dialogue. The meeting, though tense, began to show signs of progress. The boss acknowledged that the police force needed change and that perhaps it was time to consider some of the suggestions made. While the meeting advanced, James and the community realized that even if there were no guarantees of immediate results, they had planted a seed of change. Each word, every story told, contributed to creating a space where community voices could be heard. The commitment was being forged, and that could lead to something bigger. The meeting that began as a confrontation now became a space of dialogue. The tension was palpable, but there was a new determination in the air. James, Mariana, and Bradley realized they were at a critical moment, a turning point that could change the future of the community. The still hesitant police chief began to hear more carefully, his defenses falling slowly. Bradley, taking a deep breath, decided it was time to reveal a fact that could significantly impact the conversation. He talked about a personal experience that had deeply marked him. "I remember it once, when I was still in the police. It was called for an approach. That day, I looked at the man who was about to approach and realized that he was someone like me, a father, a brother. And at that moment, I realized that the way I treated him was different from what I would do with a friend or family member. It chased me, and I don't want it to happen again." Her voice was shaking, but there was a genuine force in her words. The atmosphere was loaded with emotion. James saw the reaction of the police chief, who looked shocked by Bradley's vulnerability. "If a former police officer can change his perspective, why can't we expect others to do it either?" James questioned, taking advantage of the opening that had been created. The boss, now clearly more vulnerable, paused. He looked at the community and the reports he had heard. "I don't want it to become a confrontation between us," he said. "I recognize that there were problems, and maybe it's time to look at our practices in a new way." He hesitated, but there was a slight sign of hope in the tone of his voice. The room, which was once full of hostility, now seemed a fertile field for dialogue. Mariana took the opportunity. "We need concrete actions," she said. "We can work together on a renovation plan, something that can be implemented. We don't just want words, we want tangible changes." James, feeling that the conversation was finally moving in the right direction, joined Mariana. "We are here not to accuse, but to build a better future. If we can secure a safe space for our community, everyone will win. It is a matter of justice and dignity." The police chief, reflecting on the words of James and Mariana, has finally pledged to open a communication channel with the community. He proposed the creation of a working group that would include community members and police representatives to discuss and implement reforms. "It won't be easy, and I don't have all the answers, but I'm willing to listen and learn. I believe we can do it together." The tension in the room began to dissipate, but the battle was not yet overcome. James knew it was just the beginning, a crucial step towards a longer and more challenging path. The climax was far from being resolved. The real struggle was yet to come. But at that moment, what mattered most was that the conversation was changing. However, not everything was as it seemed. When the police chief announced the creation of the working group, some voices in the room manifested with skepticism. One of the community members raised his hand. "We have tried it before. Words are just words, and we need actions that prove that things will really change." James knew that despite progress, distrust was still a major obstacle. He needed to approach this concern before the opportunity was lost. "I understand your skepticism, and it's valid. We promise we won't stop here. We need to ensure that actions are accompanied by transparency and responsibility." As the meeting progressed, James began to feel overwhelmed by the pressure. He was about to make a speech when a group of reporters entered the room, attracted by the growing tension and notoriety of the cause. The cameras were linked, and the audience was paying attention. James took a deep breath, realizing that this could be the moment when the voice of the community would be amplified. "We are here today not only to discuss changes, but to make history," James began, looking directly at the cameras. He felt the adrenaline run through his veins. "What we are doing here is not just for us, but for future generations. We are fighting for a world where people will not be judged by the color of their skin, but for their character." Mariana and Bradley joined him, creating a strong unity in front of the cameras. James's words echoed through the room, and the immediate reaction of the public was palpable. People were listening, and the message was being conveyed. When the meeting came to an end, there was a sense of optimism in the air. The creation of the working group was a step towards change, but James knew the fight was far from over. He looked at his allies, feeling the strength of the community around him. Together, they were ready to face any challenge that came ahead. The historic meeting had come to an end, but the journey was just beginning. James, Mariana, and Bradley left the police station building with a mixed sense of relief and determination. The community was willing to fight for change, and they knew that each step ahead would require effort and resilience. The voices that were once silenced now resonated, and there was a renewed commitment to enforce their claims. In the following days, the new working group began to meet regularly. James felt the pressure and responsibility on his shoulders, but there was also a flame of hope that kept him motivated. Each meeting was an opportunity to listen to community concerns and elaborate solutions. Mariana and Bradley were essential in this process, bringing their unique experiences and perspectives, ensuring that each voice was heard. The police chief, who once seemed distant and adamant, began to open. He actively participated in the meetings, discussing ideas and listening to community proposals. Although there was still distrust in some parts, there was a growing recognition that the changes were necessary. Community members began to realize that they were being treated as partners, not as opponents. One of the first changes implemented was a training program on diversity and prejudice for all police officers. James and his colleagues helped develop the content, ensuring that he was relevant and impactful. The training aimed to create empathy and understanding between the police and the community, addressing issues that were previously ignored. Meanwhile, the story of James and his struggle against prejudice gained attention. News about transformation into the police began to spread, bringing support from other groups and organizations that joined the cause. Social networks became a powerful ally, allowing the community to share their stories and experiences, as well as promote work ongoing. The change was not easy. There were always challenges to be faced, and not everyone was ready for the transformation. But James, Mariana, and Bradley remained firm, guiding the community with determination. The resistance only solidified his mission, and every little success fed his passion. One night, as they walked through the park, James and Mariana talked about the impact that the fight had had. "I never thought we would see this happen," said Mariana, smiling. "Look at the change we are already making." James nodded. "It's a beginning, but we need to make sure it becomes a continuous practice. We can't relax now." Over time, the working group has become a model for other communities, inspiring similar movements in various parts of the country. What began as a moment of crisis became a wave of change that was leading to a more inclusive and fair future. That day, looking at the bright city, James felt a sense of gratitude. They not only challenged an oppressive system, but also created a safe space for dialogues, empathy, and understanding. Community voices were finally being heard, and hope was palpable. The real victory was not just about reforming the police, but in reforming hearts and minds, and that was just the beginning. James knew that together they had the power to transform not only their city, but also the world. Months later, James walked around the city with a new look. The changes became visible. The police were closer to the community, and the bonds of trust were being strengthened. He went through a school where children were learning about respect and diversity. Seeing a colorful wall that celebrated the union, James smiled. He knew the fight was not over, but felt that the transformation was underway. With a heart full of hope, James pledged to continue to work, because after all, change begins with each of us. If you have come here, we want to hear from you. Comment, "I watched to the end," and share your reflections on the story. Your opinion is important to us and helps build a stronger community. Be sure to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell to receive notifications about new exciting stories, and click on the video that appears on the final screen. Together, we can create a space where all voices are heard. We thank you for being part of this journey and supporting the struggle for justice and equality. Until next time.